I want to welcome to the program Daniel Hunter. He is an organizer and a movement coach and trainer, founder of Choose Democracy, author of What If Trump Wins, an interactive pick your path adventure, and also the piece 10 Ways to Be Prepared and Grounded Now That Trump Has Won. That was an update from What If He Wins. Daniel, I am happy to have you here, but wish we were not having this conversation.
I feel like that's the way I've been having lots of conversations with friends and gatherings and so forth these days, which is it's good to be with other people. And I wish the circumstances of which we were gathering were different.
Yep. All right, let's go through these 10 steps. Really, okay. I mean, very helpful. And, you know, I've been sort of winging it over the past couple of days, just largely from my experience the first time around. But this is really, really helpful. And I also found it interesting. And, you know, for someone who is not necessarily immediately inclined to think this way, where in preparing yourself to help others, really, in this, you have to start with sort of like making sure, like it's psychological, what you need to do first before you start to actually get into any type of sort of like broader activism. And so for number one, you write, trust yourself. Tell us about that.
So I'm a strategist. My interest is how do we win? How do we actually beat back, the policies that Trump wants to put in place? So I surprised myself because I thought, well, I wanted to write an article about how we organize that. And for a while I thought we'll start with strategic principles, but actually we have to back up a little bit, which is what is Trump? Trump is part of a global phenomena of right-wing populists. And they're not emerging from nowhere. They're emerging from a condition in which people are feeling greater and greater distrust of social institutions, greater distrust from each other. There's greater distrust. If you remember what COVID did to a lot of us, distrust with our families and our friends. And as a person who works on climate, that's my heart. Even greater distrust in the weather. I mean, there's just, it's in the atmosphere. And so one of the things that authoritarians do so strongly is they add to that feeling of distrust, including just by our own selves. And I'm remembering the quote from 1984, that great book where, what did they say? The party told you to reject the evidence of your own eyes and ears. It was its final and most essential command. And so we have to just ground ourselves back in, you've got to trust yourself. The things you're seeing are there. You can't internalize the crazy making, or at least you can't do as much as you can to create boundaries around the crazy making that's out there. And so that became the starting point.
I had been reading, come across some reading in terms of like just abusive personal relationships. And this is also like sort of one of the sort of like core principles within the context of that is like, how do you get past the gaslighting? Before you can do anything, you need to be confident that your assessment of what's going on is in fact what's going on.
That's right. And so I think there's two steps, which is one step is building some trust in ourselves. And the second is testing it out with people that we trust, extending that trust outwards into our community, which people have been doing naturally. I mean, reaching out to friends, texting. I've noticed I'm making like a own mental list of who are the people who check in with me during this particular time, and noting that as that's a trust building measure. And so we've been gathering, and sometimes that's gathering around a fire pit. Sometimes that's just hanging out. But it's also a chance to share assessments. Not just about what happened, but about where do I want to be in these times? What are the pieces that I have to offer in what look like an uncertain environment? And so to use each other to help find grounding. So trust with ourselves, and then second, trust with each other, finding spaces to be together with other folks.
And this goes sort of dovetails into the third step, which you say is grieve. And before we get into that too, I want to say, like, based upon the first two, like, how do we assess whether we're overreacting? Right? Like, I mean, there is a tendency, I think, for some people to be like, I've got to get out of the country, et cetera. And frankly, for some people, I don't think that's, I think that's within the realm of, that's not unreasonable. I mean, if I was involved in, like, let's say, if I was on the prosecution team on the Manhattan DA's office, I might be concerned that they're coming for retribution. And I mean, I might, like, the idea of leaving the country might not necessarily be, extreme. How do we get a sense of calibrating what the threat is to us as individuals and what the threat is to different constituencies? I mean, we just spoke to an immigration lawyer, and there's like the idea of, deportation for a couple of million people is
on the table,
not in any way a overreaction to anything. And there are other cohorts of people out there. Well, how do you, like, and tie this into the grieving too, because that's also like a full assessment of, like, what the implications of this are.
Yeah. So, I mean, overreaction means that you're in reaction. You're in reaction to something else. And in this case, we're in reaction to a future that's uncertain. And so when you're in reaction to a future that's uncertain, you can't know if you're fully one way or another, right? There's no way to tell exactly what will Trump do, how extreme will it be. There's different scenarios about how that could go. So we have to check in, I think, a little bit with ourselves. And I think that's part of the community grounding, that's part of the grieving, which is to make our best assessment. And I work on climate change. And so one of the psychological dynamics that I'm familiar with is extreme thinking. So in climate change, we talk about denialism, which is the idea that in the face of uncertainty, it just isn't real. And so there's a set of people who just can't imagine climate change is real and they deny it. There's another version of inability to handle uncertainty, which is doomism. It's just over and there's nothing we can do about it. Both of those are, the therapists tell me that both of those are psychologically the same position, which is attempting to handle uncertainty by creating an absolutely certain worldview.
Right.
And so neither of those are necessarily accurate. Neither of those are backed up by sort of a scientific perspective, certainly not denialism and not doomism either. And so what that means is there's a window of uncertainty that we have to be able to tolerate. Grieving is the process of assisting us to acknowledge the things we know to be true, grieve the things we think to be true, and allow some amount of uncertainty in terms of what might happen. And that may be very uncomfortable. Humans do not like living in uncertainty, especially when it can be things as deeply personal, as passionate as, what happens to my family, what happens to my own personal safety, et cetera, et cetera. But that is the human condition, and that's the condition we're in right now under a President Trump. That's not to say that we can't find some pieces. And I think the grieving process is about starting to name out, yes, he will attempt to do a mass deportation program of some sort. Yes, he will absolutely roll back climate policies at the federal level. Yes, and on like that, beginning to name, acknowledge, and let go of. And whatever feelings arise around that, anger, frustration, sadness, that we're in those conditions. But that grieving process is so important because even if you're not necessarily a feelings person, we all remember the number of people who ran around in 2016 in this daze saying, I can't believe he's doing this. I just can't believe it. And that's a signal that people didn't do grieving, that they didn't accept the reality that's coming towards them. Because Trump told us his plan, just like, again, he told us his plan, and he intends to implement it. And it will be a more extreme version of, it's not the last 2016 experience, it's a more extreme version of that he's planning to do. So we have to accept it, believe it. Let's deal with the reality.
And so well, I guess the next part of that process is release that which you cannot change. So it's one, an acceptance of, like, this is all real and this
Yep.
is going to suck. And we just don't know exactly how it's going to suck, and it's going to be dangerous for people. And we don't know exactly how it's going to be dangerous for people and for whom. And then the next part of that is saying, okay, starting to assess. And I am the type of person where it's like, I will prepare for the worst case scenario and I'll try and get that done first.
Yeah.
So that like I can relieve myself of some of that anxiety. Like I've done everything I can do. I may be overreacting, but it's easier to course correct if I'm overreacting than it is to course correct if I'm underreacting.
I feel like my pessimist friends have been in better psychological shape at this moment than folks who are holding on to greater amounts of optimism. I do want to just caution, though, I think one thing I just want to remind people about, because you said it's going to suck, and that's absolutely true. It's also the case that it won't only suck. And so just for folks who are in the position of sort of heading into a dreary landscape of it's just going to be, it will be chaotic, it will be rough, there will be bad policies after bad policies, 3 a.m. tweets that Trump comes up with a national policy that will twist the federal instruments into a new thing. All those things are true. There will also be many beautiful days that we will experience. And so part of the protection psychologically for us is to remind ourselves to be rooted not only in what Trump is up to and tracking that, but also in the beautiful lives that we have and the family and folks around us. So just to affirm, yes, it will suck. It won't only suck. And that's a reminder that I keep getting reminded to by colleagues of mine who are living under authoritarian regimes, who keep pointing out, yes, it's bad. Some parts of it are bad, but also there's a lot of beauty. And that's a little bit of the part of like releasing out. We're not trying to control everything. We don't have to get involved in every fight. We don't have to respond to every tweet. We don't have to track every wild conspiracy theory that Trump's going to put out there. That may be important for certain people. I mean, I think, Sam, you're phenomenally good at tracking all of these things and being, educating the rest of us about what's going on. But that for all of us, we don't necessarily have to invest ourselves in all of those. And in fact, that's going to be important because we just can't psychologically, I think most of us hang on to all of those things. And so therefore we have to let go. And so I use the Serenity Prayer coming from Rael Niebuhr as the example of that, because he wrote it while he was watching the rise of Nazism.
I did not realize that. I didn't know where that came from. My perspective on it has changed insofar as like, I've seen it on doilies and in knittings, and I'm like, oh boy. But it really, when you take that, grant me the God, I guess, but really you can grant yourself the serenity to accept the things I cannot change, the courage to change things I can, and the wisdom to know the difference. When that is developed in the process of watching a fascist regime come to power, as a result of that, it's really basically in many respects saying like, take stock, deploy your resources in such a way that you don't deplete yourself, and don't, and make a wise assessment as to what the landscape is and where you are best suited to, I guess, to deploy those resources, which is number 5, find your path.
Yeah. So then we're drifting into more strategy piece where I thought, we'll get right into it, but actually, it takes some time to get to that point. Picking our path is starting to identify what are the different pathways of resistance. So 8 months ago, we began doing scenario planning with different activists. I brought them in and we did a kind of role-based, turn-based option. So Trump would do a move and then people would do a counter move as unions and activists and so forth. And initially when we began doing it, activists picked essentially 2 big strategies, which was let's keep doing petitions. Let's get a lot of people to say this is outrageous in some way. And the second was let's get a lot of people to show up at marches, rallies, protests, etc. And Trump didn't care about either of them. He just kept implementing policy. Trump would do this, we would do a march, and he'd say, okay, and then he'd keep going. And so we started to get more clear about, we need to help people understand certain roles will be more important. It's not to say there's not a role for marches, not to say it's not a role for outrage, but it's a different ballgame. We're not dealing with a man who values democratic spirit. We're dealing with someone who is a bully and authoritarian. And so a bully doesn't care about your feelings. A bully wants you to be in pain. So expressions of pain isn't the thing that's moving him. So that means we have to find out different roles. So I just sort of identified 4 that we started to see over and over again that were strategies for combating. So one of them is just protecting people. Huge amount of people are going to be lives disrupted, trans folks, immigrants, et cetera, et cetera. So the role of developing mutual aid conditions, developing mechanisms for us to protect people who are politically targeted. I hope some of these people who are targeted don't flee overseas, that they don't go overseas, and that we can, in fact, give them a lot of security support in our own communities. Second one is disrupting and disobeying. That's the one that I come from. That's the place that I have the most experience. And that's strategizing acts of non-cooperation. So in fact, the Fed chairman, Jerome Powell, is now in that category, as he just announced, will you resign if Trump asks you to resign? He said, no, I will disobey what I believe is a wrong order. And that's the behavior, actually, that will be very helpful for stopping an authoritarian.
We should also say that announcing that is also very important, right? Because it's the flip side of what we saw with Bezos and the endorsement for Kamala Harris.
That's right.
I don't think that endorsement would have meant anything. What it really signaled to me was like, oh, this, at the very least, this billionaire, I mean, this is the model, right, for how the fascism grows, where the billionaire goes, I can do what I've been doing, but I'm going to go with the path of least resistance, and I'm going to take that path before I even get to the turn in the road. Like, he doesn't even have to threaten me. I'm going to do it in advance. And Powell sort of like, he could say, well, I'm not going to address this now, and then have done, but by saying it out front, he's emboldening other people to take a similar position without it having to happen to him.
That's right. And that's a signal for the rest of us. So for those of us who are in government jobs, for example, to not resign, not make this easy for them to have a power vacuum, but to hold on and to use our professional ethics, remind ourselves, remind people of, we have codes of conduct, we have internal ethics processes that we want to uphold and stay despite the Trump administration's attempt. Okay, so we've got protecting people. I'm just going to name the 4 here. So protecting people, disrupting and disobeying, and then defending civic institutions. And so all the folks who are both bureaucrats who are inside will be involved in, hopefully, a defense for that institution, for the EPA to continue to do the thing that it does. And for the U.S. military, for example, who's been told, we've been forewarned, Trump has intentions of using the Insurrection Act to deploy military against protesters in the streets, me. And the military knows that will forever politicize them if they were to be using live bullets against protesters and doing lethal damage. And so that they understand Trump's putting them between a rock and a hard place, either disobeying orders or outright, or engaging in what will be the end of the military as we know it in this country. So defense. So every one of those civic institutions has its own strategy, and those of us on the outside also get to support them, partially by holding up a mirror to how resistance can look and encouraging them, celebrating the people like Jerome when he does that thing, yay Jerome, and celebrating people who get fired when they get fired for the right things, and so on. And so we have a role and responsibility in playing that.
You talk about this later in the piece, the idea of you sitting down, like I know you've done some other sort of game theory sort of conferences with military or ex-military people, and you saying like it was weird for you to be sitting there because those aren't the type of people you tend to strategize with. And I'm sitting here like the Hegseth is going in to clearly be part of a process of purging the military of people who they think is not going to be loyal to Donald Trump, as opposed to the institution or the Constitution, which, supposedly are aligned. And, me having to get over my sort of like, I don't know if I would call it prejudice, because my disposition towards the military, I don't think it's unfair prejudice, but like I have a healthy skepticism about the military. But in this moment, like we're in like popular front mode for these type of things, because it could be that serious. I mean, that's the tricky part, is that there are going to be voices out there, and I obviously I conceive of this in my world, but there are going to be voices in my world, in my universe of like of YouTube and Twitter and whatnot, who are going to be like, oh, you're making common cause with the generals or something like that, and it's going to trigger my like, I don't want to make common cause with the generals. I don't like the generals. I don't like the military. But in this instance, like, maintaining a focus on where the threat lies in this moment. Like, how do you do that? I mean, on some level, we saw it with like Harris getting together with Lynn Cheney now, or Liz Cheney. The problem I have with that is I just think it was going to be effective. I was like, if they're going to do that and it works, okay, for the time being, I can fight this other fight later. And I mean, I even remember a story, like an Israeli general was like told at one point, like, you realize your supposed allies in the United States, these Christian Zionists, they want you to burn in hellfire when the second coming goes. And he goes, I'll deal with that bridge when I get to it. And they have made that, alliance. I mean, that adopting that mindset seems to me to be a big, it's much easier for me to do it with EPA scientists. And it's much easier for me to do it with like some people in the DOJ, maybe, depending on where they are, and in, the National Labor Relations Board or et cetera, et cetera. But there are certain areas where I have a reflexive like, ooh, but you can't have that because it's about the civic institution and not almost like what fills it.
Yeah, I mean, I think there's two aspects of it. I mean, one, we don't have to play all roles. So I'm not a defend civic institution person by my nature. I have a different belief system, and it's not in defending the current version of democracy that the US has. But I am aware how destructive it will be if some of these institutions are fully taken out. In the case of the military, it's very practical, though. It's the second one for me, which is I don't want to get shot in the streets, and there are folks inside who also don't want to shoot me.
Right.
And so those are aligned in that aspect of it. And I think what that means is that what we're doing here is we're not building a sort of framework of common cause of we're all aligned in the movement together, but instead it's more understanding we have overlapping interests here about not getting the military to be involved in this particular set of behaviors. So I think both of those, can go hand in hand. And you're mentioning this is so important because it brings up the fourth category, which is alternative institution building, which is, it's not enough. I mean, for those of us who are deeply unhappy with the current system as it exists, we're not interested in just defending the previous version of democracy that the US has had. Instead, we're interested in new. Can we get rid of the Electoral College? Can we talk about developing participatory democracy mechanisms? Can we talk about strengthening education? Because you cannot have a meaningful democracy without education, representation, participation, and we barely have representation. So I think, the alternative institution building is a place for those of us who want to pour our energy into tracking all the many things that need to be changed and creating those institutions to do that. And so the reason I find those 4 roles so helpful is because we're not going to be attracted to all of them.
Right.
But it will be helpful for us to observe other people doing some of those roles that will be useful for us at some other moment. And I want to flag it.
And having some respect that they're doing it, like being able to say, like, this is not what I want to do. I don't like it. I'm allergic to this. But being able to accept, like, it needs to be done. And I'm glad that somebody's doing it.
It's all going to be hard work. Protecting the EPA is going to be hard work. Supporting people who are undocumented to find safe places is going to be hard work. It's going to be hard work all around. And so if we're not in appreciation mode, if we're just in criticism mode of that strategy isn't the way I think that everyone else should go, then we're going to spend a lot of energy attacking each other rather than appreciating the movement ecosystem and appreciating the different roles, including what I'm finding with some of my own friends is that roles that I used to play 4 years ago or 8 years ago, I'm finding I'm feeling called to something new and appreciating that within their own selves, that maybe I didn't want to be a disrupt person, but actually this is now too extreme.
Number 6, you have do not obey in advance, do not self-censor. I mean, we sort of touched on that in terms of, like, Jerome Powell in the Fed. I mean, he is announcing beforehand that, like, if you do this thing, I'm not going to do it. And, in the context of this job, when I was doing Air America, we were all like, we're going to get audited, probably. I mean, we didn't, which I frankly was surprised about. And I wouldn't be surprised if I get audited in this situation, just because of the nature. One of the reasons why I got fired from MSNBC was because we went after Mike Cernovich. And, he got Jack Posobiec to dig up an old tweet. They got Don Jr. to retweet it, and then it was off to the races. And that specter of, like, do we keep our head down or something like that? And in the meantime, I mean,
would you do it again, Sam?
Would I do that tweet? Oh, that tweet. Yeah, it was a funny tweet. I mean, no, that experience worked out quite well for me. I mean, at the end of the day, but
well, that's the story to tell, Sam. That's exactly it. That's exactly the point, which is it may be the case that you might lose your job at the EPA by doing a resistance something. And it may be the case that you will be so proud to tell your kids and grandkids that you were part of a very important resistance campaign. And so that's the historical moment we're in, which is it's a great moment to take great pride in acts of resistance, tweaking, noses of the elites, whatever it is. And so in that way, it's almost a different relationship to repression than the relationship of I'm so worried about getting repressed. And absolutely, I believe people should make good calls. I think I have no judgment of anyone's individual circumstances. But what we're aware of is the primary way that authoritarians, we see this across the globe in Hungary and Brazil and Turkey, the primary way that authoritarians are able to claim control isn't through a lot of repression. It's through occasional repression that scares people so they know what to do in this administration. And therefore, they cede power right away. Power you don't use, you lose.
It's sort of the Fonzie theory, where he told Richie, I'm talking about Happy Days. Nobody knows what I'm talking about because I'm so old. But
sorry, Sam, you have to bring me in.
It's almost not worth it. I don't think there's anybody alive who knows what I'm talking about. But there was a show called Happy Days. It was very popular. Fonzie was the tough kid, and Richie wanted to know why it was that everybody listened to Fonzie. He's like, I hit somebody once. That's all I had to do. And then everybody else knew not to mess with me at that point. But this is also a little bit more like, getting people to self-censor. And that doesn't mean necessarily if you're the EPA, you quit. It could mean you stay in there and you fight. And, people have got to make that decision. Reorient your political map was what we were talking about earlier in terms of you were doing some game theory essentially with people that you otherwise could just have easily been protesting in another circumstance. But it's about assessing the moment and understanding and prioritizing sort of like what's going to keep you from getting shot at, I guess, out on the streets.
Yeah, I mean, just to affirm my credentials here, my first arrest was against Fort Benning, Georgia, for its support for training people to assassinate human rights workers overseas. And so, yes, so the common, and I told the generals that I told these ex-generals my story, and they shared their story, and here we are in
that wasn't moment. The School of the Americas, was it? Or is
it was the School of Americas?
Okay, yeah. Okay.
So the reorientation of the political map, I think, has to do with when you have an authoritarian, it takes a while for people to catch several nodes. I think one of them is right now, a lot of us are really oriented around who voted for Trump and who didn't. And that's one way to analyze. It's not a very great way to analyze because, in fact, on lots of policies, on lots of issues, the way these things split is very different. And progressive policies are very popular. They remain very popular when you ask people, do you want clean water, clean air? Do you want to deal with climate change with renewable energy? Do you want to keep people who are here
expanded Social Security? I mean,
exactly right.
Healthcare, whatever. Yeah.
Name it. So they continue to be very, excuse me, they continue to be very positive. And so sticking to the framing around Trump, not Trump, won't necessarily be helpful in the long term. So at some point, we're going to have to break apart our political map a little bit. And it's not about did you vote for this man or not. It's more about, and therefore sort of the party element of it. And it's more about going back to the policies, going back to the ways these policies harm or don't harm real people. And so that's one aspect of it. And I think another aspect of it is under an authoritarian regime, there will be new, I mean, we use the word common cause and then said don't use it, but some version of common cause with people who we do find abhorrent. What do we do when Liz Cheney gets arrested? What's our relationship to showing up for her in this particular moment of watching him attempt to scare other people? And I think that's part of it is then dealing with the political repression.
That's honestly the perfect example to like really freeze me in my tracks, because just even at the words Liz Cheney gets arrested, I'm like, I felt like I felt a smile brewing inside me, but that's exactly what I have to fight against.
I hear you. Well, no, you can still, I think we should figure out how way to be both. I think we should be able to say, yeah, it's a shame she's getting arrested for the wrong reasons, or, whatever it is for us. But honestly, I think the truth is that we do have to do a kind of reorientation around people who are, particularly when we're seeing visibilized repression, even if those people aren't necessarily in our milieu, the political repression is not attempting to just freeze us. It's trying to freeze a population.
Right.
And so I'm jumping ahead here to number 9, but I'll walk into
it's like focusing on the act that is taking place rather than who is it's subject to.
That's right. And so the attitude we have in terms of when that happens. So one aspect of when political repression happens is we can share the story. That's horrible. Can you believe that they arrested Liz Cheney or Daniel Hunter or Sam or whoever? That's one way of telling that story. Another way of telling that story, I think I'm inspired by a group named Otpor in Serbia. So they were dealing with a dictatorship who was very repressive. They regularly beat up Otpor folks. And they used to have a saying that they would say, it only hurts when you're scared. And what they meant by that was they were attempting to create a story that says, we're not going to engage in fear. The major tool of an authoritarian is fear, and we're not going to feed that fear. In fact, quite the opposite. We're going to express and show bravery in the face of it. I did ask one of them, does it hurt less if you're scared? He said, no, it hurts the same amount no matter what. But the point here is attitude. That we're going to take a different attitude than being nervous, scared, joke about, I don't want to get on a list, I want to get on a list. So one response politically, for example, I think I tell this, the article is a story from someone I've learned a lot from, Bayard Rustin. He was dealing with Martin Luther King at a period of time when Martin Luther King was very young and new to nonviolence theory. He and a bunch of other folks in Montgomery were being threatened with arrest. So they went underground. A lot of the preachers were like hiding out in other people's houses. King himself had like left the city for a while. And Bayard Rustin walked around and said, this is not how we should be. He was trained by Gandhi and had a Gandhian philosophy. And he said, you shouldn't be hiding, worried about what's going to happen to you. Go the opposite direction, go towards it. And so he convinced a couple of people, pastors who were likely on this list of arrests, to go down to the police station with their congregation and to demand that they get arrested there and then. And so they went in, several of them got booked, and more people began to show up as the crowd like swelled, as people came out holding their citations proudly. And in fact, some leaders went into the room demanding that they get arrested, were turned away because they were told they weren't on the list. And they said, I'm a leader. What are you talking about? I should absolutely be arrested as well. And so they began arguing that they should get arrested, because what would their people think if they didn't get arrested? They weren't really a leader. So it became, instead of being a fear-inducing tactic, the arrests themselves became part of a signal of strength.
Well,
And that's what I'm talking about.
you're also in that moment taking power, because you get to dictate.
Absolutely.
You get to
Exactly.
dictate at least one element of this. If you're going to arrest me, you're going to do it on my terms, and that's going to be right now, right here, that type of thing.
That's right. And you're doing it with your people. You're getting to say, signal. Again, this is attitude. This is about expressing an attitude towards repression, which is, rather than grinning, bearing, and being scared of it, that we. It's not always that we invite it. That's not at all what I'm suggesting here. But it's about the attitude that we take when it comes our way. And so I think we have a lot of control. And in fact, everybody has a lot of influence about what kinds of stories do we tell when so-and-so gets arrested out of the government or fired or whatnot. We should cheer. Congratulations. Welcome to the club.
Yeah. Let's talk about the get real about power. This is really interesting. The upside down triangle. What does that tell us about power?
So the upside down triangle comes from folks in Thailand, were some of the first originators of it. And what they did was it's a theory of power. So you imagine an upside down triangle, and it's not stable. An unjust power is not actually a stable power. It needs pillars of support to keep it up. And those pillars may include a mainstream media that tells a positive story about them, or most recently from the last election, that treats them like, equivalents. There's this and that, and Trump said this and Harris said that, as if they're in equivalent worlds. There's military, there's in any number of different institutions. But also that those things, all of those aren't done, they aren't implemented by the elites. People in power that we think of traditionally in power, they don't do anything. They tell other people to do things, and other people obey. When people don't obey, these systems start to fall apart very quickly. And that is the long arc around dealing with authoritarianism. So in other regimes, like when we're dealing with regime change in other parts of the globe, the pathway to resistance is developing a long story about why people should stop obeying an unjust authority. And if Trump turns out to be the person that many of us believe him to be, he is and will be an unjust authority in the authoritarian style. That kind of style doesn't respond to democratic norms. That style may or may not even respond to whether or not in the next election pushes him out. The reality is that we have someone in power who's attempted coup. And so we have to get real about power. And that means convincing large swaths of the population to potentially not obey. I'll just give 3 examples of it. I'll give one clean example that tactically that's being talked about now, which is the idea of a general strike is a way to disable parts of the economy such that the whole system can't keep grinding forward. So that's one conversation that's happening around sort of in the non-cooperation circle of people. And I think I just want to say this, which is at this stage where we are, it can seem impossible to imagine Trump being kicked out because we're so far out of that period. So we're not there yet. Non-cooperation always starts small. It's always ineffective in the beginning because you're not at the size to be able to work. But very targeted non-cooperation has a history of success and has an ability to change national policy in a way that just pleading and asking for government officials isn't necessarily successful. I tell a story from one of my mentors who recently passed away, Dick Taylor. He was involved in a thing called blockades, where they were trying to stop the U.S., who was supporting a dictator, Yahya Khan, of East Pakistan, what we now know as Bangladesh. Yahya Khan was involved in mass murders, huge amounts of people were dying, and the U.S. was the sole country basically arming him, sending armor shipments. So this group found out in Philadelphia, a group of Quakers, that the arm shipments were being loaded here in Philadelphia. And so they said, you know what we're going to do? We're going to stop them. We're going to organize the naval blockade. And they, with their 25, 30 people, jumped into boats and began blocking these massive arm shipments. As expected, they were pulled out by a Coast Guard, and they weren't successful on their first forays, but they began doing it over and over again. Eventually, they got to international longshoremen, and the longshoremen are the folks who load those arm shipments on and off. And the longshoremen said, if you guys set up a picket line, we won't cross it. They were moved by these stories of what was going on, and they realized they had a role to play in history. And so they refused to load these arm shipments. As a result, U.S. was no longer, first they stopped using Philadelphia ports, then New York City ports, then on and on until eventually they got the longshoremen all across the East Coast to stop loading arm shipments. That's non-cooperation. That's not a protest in the streets. That's not asking for it. That's not pleading for. It's saying there's a thing we're going to get in the way of, either as the Quakers who are jumping into the boats or as the longshoremen who are saying we're not going to load, we're not going to obey. And that was the major contributor towards shifting U.S. foreign policy in terms of supporting that particular dictator. So that's a history I want us to just be alert to, because it tells a story about how non-cooperation can be successful in this country. And that stratagem of understanding the pillars of support is about, if you pull enough pillars, it doesn't mean we have to convince the elites to go along with us. We're not going to convince Elon Musk. We're not going to convince Donald Trump. We're not going to convince the Trump family. But if we're able to pull pillars, they don't have a choice, because they don't do anything. They don't work. They don't do real things. They don't do things with their hands. People who do things with their hands, they can make decisions about how we actually do things. When we do it in united front, as we can collectively do non-cooperation. That's the pillars of power. That's the upside down triangle. When we pull those pillars away, the triangle falls.
And number 10 is envision a better, a positive future. And I think, we're going to spend time here, obviously, and talking to authors and people. A plan is better than no plan. And it's important for us, even in eras where we don't have the immediate ability to make, to shape society in the way that we want it to. It's important to have a sort of a northern light, I guess, and some ideas about what we would do if we were in power, both as an inspiration and you never know. You never know. And that is a big deal. Well, this is, Daniel, this is really, really helpful, and we're going to put a link to this and to your book, and we will check back in with you hopefully soon to get a sense of where we're at and what's turning. One thing I just want to ask you about that is sort of off this list. I see things like how we can create fissures within the constituency that has been supportive of Trump. I mean, you've talked about that a little bit, but like, I'm looking at like this Bobby Kennedy stuff, and I don't know if he actually wants to get into the administration or he's just trying to raise money or what the deal is. But a lot of the stuff that he proposes is completely antithetical to Trump's agenda. Like they want to get rid of the administrative state, and he supposedly wants to make the FDA, the EPA, the USDA more effective. He also wants everybody to get hepatitis or other diseases. But there are elements of what he wants to do that people are attracted to, people who are supportive of Trump, and they don't seem to realize that it's fundamentally at odds with the other part of Trump's agenda, which is to get rid of the administrative state. There's corporations are not going to take yellow dye number 7 out of Captain Crunch by themselves. And so is there a concept of like strategically creating cleaves within their constituencies? Like, is that a strategy? Is there like, what are the tactics associated with that?
Yeah, I mean, I think, yes. I mean, the reality here is this is a riotous group of people who've been out of power for quite some time. They are not in alignment. They're not in agreement. And they're basically being held together by loyalty, an authoritarian loyalty system, which is perhaps more dangerous than being in alignment in some ways, because it allows them to move on a dime. Trump says, we'll do this. And they say, okay, that's the way we're heading. So that is in some ways, certain ways, potentially more dangerous. But it is true. They're not in agreement. They're not in alignment. And some of those things I think can be taken advantage of. I think the most effective way for us to do that is to really be rooted in our own values and asserting what's the vision that we have to become attractive. Because infighting can be handled and managed if we don't know if that's handleable, manageable. But Trump is very relaxed about a lot of chaos in his administration. That's what we've seen. So the idea that there's infighting, he likes. So I don't think it's an attempt to just kind of add drama to that. But I think it's about cleaving off parts of it and saying, for folks who either supported Trump, for folks who didn't vote for whatever reason, I think there's opportunity here to say, here's a vision that you have that we're in alignment with. And to cleave in that way by being attractive, because the future that we're going to need is going to need a lot of people to have increased trust in us and our vision and in a sort of progressive worldview that is not well understood, actually, by a lot of the folks in sort of that group. So I'm less trying to get to the elites, and I'm more trying to cleave off the supporters, people who back Trump. But we'll find out that he has every intention to screw them. That's why he's putting billionaires in. He's not going to represent them and their interests. So they need a place to land. And so I think we need to create some open invitations, some places to do it.
Daniel Hunter, the book is What If Trump Wins? An interactive pick your path adventure, and 10 ways to be prepared and grounded now that Trump has won. We'll put a link to all of that, and hope to talk to you soon. Thank you so much.
You, Sam.
Really,
great to talk.
Really helpful.
Thanks.
Folks, well, we're going to head into the fun half.
The fun half hour.
The fun half hour. There you go. The fun. Yes, exactly. Not quite. Look, we're not great with math here. Well, I think, we'll talk about this, but I think we should clip Daniels and maybe rerun it soon, because sometimes I get lost. You got too long, and they were both very important relative to like sort of the immediate things that we're going to be facing. But we will both clip Daniel's interview either as a standalone or within the next 3 or 4 weeks. We'll just play it again as if it was, a quick repeat, because I think it's really helpful to give people I found it incredibly helpful just to read it, to get a sense of like, okay, this is how we're going to approach this. And here's the value in doing it this way and that way. I think it's really good. Hey, folks, don't forget to hit the subscribe button and check out our daily show. We do it every day at 12 p.m. Eastern for about 2.5 hours. We even take phone calls. You should check that out.